Welcome, everyone. On behalf of React 19, we are very lucky to have Dr. Jim Jackson speaking to us today about depression and suicide due to chronic illness. Experiencing this vaccine reaction has been the ultimate challenge, both physically and mentally, of my life. I know many of you would agree. We are looking forward to hearing from Dr. Jackson about how we can better cope with these challenges. Dr. Jackson is a research professor of medicine and psychiatry at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, a neuropsychologist, and the director of long-term outcomes at the Critical Illness, Brain Dysfunction, and Survivorship, or CIBS Center at Vanderbilt. Dr. Jackson works extensively with individuals experiencing long COVID in a variety of clinical and research contexts. He is internationally renowned expert on the effects of illness, including long COVID, on cognitive and mental health functioning. He is the author of over 150 scientific papers, as well as dozens of book chapters and editorials. His research has been highlighted in the pages of The Atlantic, Newsweek, The New York Times, Scientific American, Time Magazine, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, Wired, as well as on CNN and PBS. Please welcome Dr. Jackson.
Yeah, it's nice to be with you, Denise. It's really funny. I hear that introduction, which sounds, impressive, and I think, well, who is that exactly? Who are you? Who are you describing? And then I realize, oh, it's me. And then I realize, gosh, I've been really blessed to work in this field, for over 2 decades now. And one consistent finding, both in the context of chronic illness, in the context of long COVID, I think in the context of vaccine injury, is that depression is a frequent phenomenon, and sometimes diagnostically that is a dysthymia, kind of a chronic low-grade depression, but often it's what we call a major depression, and a major depression is what people think of classically when they think of depression, which is a depression marked by things like worry about the future and loss of hope and very significant anxiety and disengagement and decreased motivation, things that come on rather quickly and that are really hard to shed. And that's what we often see. I don't know that there are statistics about depression rates in vaccine injured patients. There may be research that highlights that. But if we look at people with chronic illness more generally, and if we look at survivors of COVID who identify as having long COVID, it seems like the depression rates are probably in the range of 26 or 27% to 34 or 35%. I'm not a mathematician, not even close, but that's about 1 in 3, right? Somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 3. And if you look at the number of people who have COVID, that's a number, conservatively, that's a number estimated to be more people than live in the country of Mexico, the country of Russia. It's almost as many people as live in Brazil, a couple 100 million people. And those people have long COVID. And I don't know what the vaccine injury number is, but it's a large number. So the point being, we're talking about an individual problem, yes, but we're also talking about a societal problem. We're talking about a public health emergency represented by these mental health challenges. And I think often people don't necessarily recognize what is happening, that is, that they're suffering from depression. And equally, I think in some cases when they are, they feel ashamed and they're reluctant to pursue help for a variety of reasons. One, because they feel like they shouldn't be struggling. And two, I think because they often feel like, in the vaccine injured context in particular, in the long COVID context, because they feel like they may be dismissed or marginalized by healthcare providers. And as a consequence, they decide to suffer in silence, if you will, rather than engage providers who all too often are skeptical on the benign end and dismissive or shaming on the more toxic end. So that's often what we see, that there's a barrier to treatment. And when people get treatment, not surprisingly, that depression often gets better. But if they don't get treatment, it's not hugely different than other things, right? Like wishing and hoping won't make depression go away. And very often, the longer you wait to engage it, not only can it be harder to treat because it's more entrenched, but also the longer you wait to engage it, the more damage it perhaps has done to relationships, to jobs, to a variety of different things, which is one reason why we invite people, that you don't have to do this, but we invite people to try to address it relatively rapidly, because again, the more it spreads, the more it impacts other areas of your life. And it may be that many people who are vaccine injured may not be in the workforce anyway, but there are a number of people who are. And sometimes depression is the tipping point that makes them unable to work, less able to work. They sometimes wind up getting fired from their job, laid off, those sorts of things. And we worry about that. I think identifying symptoms of depression fairly early on and seeking that treatment is really important. There are a couple of pathways to treat depression, and in general, those pathways are psychotherapy via one path and medication via another path. And those aren't mutually exclusive. Typically, I encourage people to pursue psychotherapy as a first-line option. And indeed, many people who have long COVID and are vaccine injured as well, they're a little skeptical about the medical establishment, and psychiatrists sometimes feel a little more medical than therapists might. So often the psychotherapy approach feels better and safer as a first line. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that things like cognitive therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy are very effective for the treatment of depression. I feel like often the best approach is you begin the process of therapy, and then you work collaboratively with that mental health provider to decide whether you need psychiatric treatment in the form of medication or not. And that often emerges, the answer to that question often emerges over time. Certainly one of the reasons this is important, one of the reasons it's important to me, is because many of us, and it sounds like many of you, have had interaction and engagement with people who have been so profoundly depressed that they have taken their lives. They've decided that for them, and it's hard to know what people's motivations are, right? And it's hard to understand how rational or how irrational people are at the end of the day. But it sounds like some people in your community have actively decided, I'm going to take my life. The choice that makes sense for me is I'm going to take my life. And as a psychologist, you can move people off of that place, out of that stance, perhaps, and certainly we try to, but a far better strategy is to try to avoid getting to that place in the first place, right? And that's a little bit of a defensive stance, but that's the goal, right? Like, let's stem the tide here before this becomes a profound suicidal depression. Let's stem the tide here. And that's why this is really important. And I think this is a really important topic. So I'm glad to engage it. And I'm going to ask some questions and see if people are willing to participate with me a bit in a conversation, and we'll find out pretty quickly if you are and if you won't. If you don't, that's fine, and then we'll go in a little bit of a different direction. But let's talk about this. What are signs of depression that would lead you all to decide yourselves to seek treatment? And what are signs of depression that would cause you to say, I'm not too worried about this. I'm just going to hunker down and wait it out. Let's start with that. And I see a comment, by the way, and I'm glad to engage it. There's no question that some of this depression is driven by what we might call physical symptoms, classic medical symptoms, right? And I know those are wide ranging, and those include a lot of idiosyncratic sorts of things. Those include intense pain. Those include a wide array of symptoms. So I understand that's at the root of the depression, but we want to avoid, and this I feel strongly about, right? We want to avoid a situation where we say, the only way to cure the depression is to fix the vaccine injury, right? We can't have that formula, right? We don't want that formula because these injuries, or if we change topics a little, long COVID, it does what it does, right? It might last a long time. It might not. People might recover. They might not. People might get better, then they might get worse and better. It's often not linear. So when I talk to our long COVID patients, I'm desperately inviting them to consider the idea that, as unpleasant as it seems, let's try to find a way to live with long COVID, and let's try not to say, gosh, the only way I can have a life that is remotely fulfilling now is if my long COVID symptoms improve, right? We don't want to do that, right? And long before, and I'm not suggesting it's easy, right? I'm not suggesting it's simple. I have a chronic illness, OCD. It's quite significant. It's sometimes severe. And when I developed OCD, out of the blue, kind of in 2018, I thought, I'm going to have to eradicate this, and we're going to pull it out like a weed. And I went to my psychologist and I asked her to do that. And she said, I don't think it works that way. I'm not really sure that we're going to be able to pull it out like a weed. And I said, well, where does that leave us? Because I don't like having OCD very much. And she said, well, have you thought that you might need to accept it? And I was appalled. I thought, and she's very kind and lovely and gentle. But I thought, oh my gosh, like, you're asking me to accept this? I can't believe you would be so stupid to even say that. And I quickly realized that if it wasn't going away, what were my choices, right? Not to like it, not to embrace it, but to find a way to live with it. So I'm not wanting to be trite or casual and say, hey, just live with a vaccine injury. It's no problem. It's a big problem, right? Not wanting to be trite about that. But I am wanting us not to construct a math equation which basically says decreased symptoms equals a happy life, maintenance of vaccine injured symptoms equals major depression. We don't want to set it up that way, if that makes sense. We don't want to do that. So, so to go back to the question, what are depressive symptoms that that would cause you to seek treatment, and what are depressive symptoms that you might just choose to live with? Thoughts about that? And how important do you all think treatment for depression is?
I could speak for
Yeah,
myself.
just jump on in. Yep.
Early on in my illness, I had unbearable pain. And I know what you're saying, but when you're in agonizing pain, you can't rationalize, well, I'm going to have to learn to live with this because it's truly unlivable pain.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people have experienced this. The vaccine, for some reason, causes this intense neuropathic syndrome of pain. For me, it was particularly in my face. So I was screaming in pain. So I could not come to terms with it. And I found myself crying all day long and actually not wanting to live in this way. I'd never been suicidal before. I had a nice life. I had no reason to want to end my life before, but it was unbearable. So those were the major symptoms that I was having: crying, contemplating suicide, very depressed. I couldn't really do anything.
Yeah. And Denise, I agree with that. And again, I don't want to be casual about this at all, but what I would say is, in the throes of that, you had the choice to take your life, right? Like, you could have decided to do that, right? And it would have been horrible. and for whatever reason you decided not to, right? You decided to take a different path, and you're here today with us because you decided not to do that, right?
And I'm
Um,
very happy that I made that decision because I'm better now.
yeah,
And
right,
I'm able to engage in life again, and it was worth the agony. I had a supportive family. I have a daughter that a young daughter that I wanted to see grow up, and I held on to those things very tightly. But there are people in our groups, who are more alone and
no doubt.
have made those decisions to end their lives. And
No,
it's
no doubt, no doubt. And I want to be really clear to everybody. I'm not suggesting for a second, not for a nanosecond, if that's the thing, that this would be easy. I don't think that remotely. I just think that sometimes when we're in the throes of the very worst pain that we feel, when we're at our very worst, whatever that is, we're not necessarily making rational decisions, right? And we sometimes are not able to even imagine, we can't even conceive of the idea that things could be different than they are right now, right? When my OCD was at its very worst, my brain kept telling me, it's always going to be this way. You can't possibly live like this, right? It's always going to be this way. And I think my invitation is to start with, let's not believe everything we think, right? Let's commit to not believing everything we think. And let's realize that thoughts are thoughts. Now, these are cliches here, right? But let's not believe everything we think, and let's realize that thoughts are thoughts. Thoughts are not facts. Okay, very important. What are other, and thank you, Denise, what are other symptoms that people might have with regard to depression that would cause them to say, oh gosh, I'd better pursue treatment for this. This is a concern. I'd better pursue treatment for this.
I think for me, I was one of those people, sorry, I'm back's injured and I'm a long hauler now, so
Yeah.
double whammy. But so for
Thanks.
me, there was a time at the very beginning where my brain just was altered, like the inflammation was out of control.
Right.
Personality was different, everything was different. And so that was like one level of depression, if you could call it that. But then it morphed into this other phase where it was the chronic pain, the electrical sensations, the what ifs, it was just this ruminating thing that just kept going in my head. And then I just kept going, well, if I'm not gonna get better, then what's the point of living, right? And then as soon as it was every single day, right? It wasn't just a fleeting moment here or there. And then it was my thoughts all the time. And so that's when I realized that, okay, I need some professional help.
And Bree, can I ask, I appreciate you being vulnerable there. What did you do? You went to talk to a therapist or a psychiatrist, or what did you do?
I actually went to a psychiatrist first because they told me this was anxiety.
Yeah.
So my legs stopped working and I was incontinent because of anxiety. And the psychiatrist told me, no, it's not anxiety.
Yeah.
And so he referred me to a psychologist.
Yeah.
And on the side, he had me work with a nutritionist, actually, and that actually helped my mental stuff a lot.
That's great. Yep. Yeah, very good. And I think people often think, and I don't have an issue with people thinking this, because I think people have been marginalized, they've been dismissed, gaslighted, whatever word you want to use, but I think people feel like if you go see a psychologist, they're probably simply going to try to convince you that this is in your head, and I'm here to say there might be some psychologists that would do that, but not all of them do. And psychologists have a lot to add in the context of helping people cope, helping people figure out how to cope in the context of really hard things, right? So when I see people who are vaccine injured or they have long COVID, our goal is not to try to talk them into the notion that this is a psychosomatic phenomenon, not at all. The goal is to try to help them remember that they can still do hard things, right? That they can lean into hard things, that they're stronger than they know, and that there are scientific tools and techniques that are well validated that can both help improve depression and can lead to more effective coping and resilience, right? So that's the key. I think what happens though, and this is what I would say that's really important. Sometimes when people go too far down this slide into depression, it can be really hard to pry them out of that and get them to see a mental health provider, partly because they frankly don't even have the energy to do it, right? Or the motivation. So if some of you are, God forbid, you know, headed down in a negative direction right now, but you're not at the bottom, let's not wait to get to the bottom before we reach out to a therapist, right? Like, let's reach out today and or tomorrow, and even if the only thing that happens during that first encounter is you say, you know, I'm not ready to do this, I don't think I need this, but at least I've got your number, we've got a relationship, you're going to be available now to me if I need it, so I can call you, right? Even if the only thing is that you create a connection with someone that you can rely on later, that's really important, right? So this is not something we want to play a game of chicken with, right? This is something that we really want to address. Other thoughts about treatment for depression and whether that might be helpful, whether people see that as important, and whether there were triggers that led you to say, this isn't something I should do, this is something I must do. Other thoughts about this? Thank you, Bree. I'm happy to talk a lot, so if other people don't jump in, there's no problem. But other thoughts about this?
There are a lot of things in the chat, but I don't know if people are able to speak out or not.
Alex
So-
actually raised his
There.
hand, so let's give this a
Okay.
try. Hi, Alex.
Good evening or good morning in my case. Thank
Hey,
you
Alex.
for thank you for doing this. I
pleasure.
am the one of the UK VITs, the vaccine-induced thrombotic thrombocythemia. I'm the first to survive with the level of clots that I had. The reality is the conversation we have shouldn't be, for want of a better word. I was given no hope of survival. The result of which I'm now, my blood has been changed permanently and it can't be changed back
Yeah,
at this moment in time. I'm an amputee from above the knee
yeah,
and I'm going blind in one eye. So
Yeah.
I'm kind of really throwing everything at you here. What I will say is that we were offered clinical support from Thrombosis UK, a wonderful charity in the UK. And I always remember my first conversation with the individual. And he said to me, you will suffer every emotion that you can imagine, and a lot of emotions you don't even know.
yes,
It's okay to feel that way. Every one of them. It's only when you stay in that position, it's not good for you and it's not healthy. And I
right,
think that is the hardest thing. I talk from a personal level when I look at the life I had, the life I've now got, and what's ahead. Now, it would be easy for me to go into a corner and feel sorry for myself.
right,
And I think many of us on these, particularly on this, would agree with me in saying that sometimes that's the only place you want to go, into
Yes.
that corner.
right,
I just want to let people know it's fine to be there, but don't stay there.
yeah, yeah,
That's the hardest part. When you don't see positives, is when you can only see darkness.
yeah,
And I'm not here because I'm depressed. I'm not here because I don't see any hope. I have accepted and can't change what's happened. And I think that's the philosophy I've got in life.
yeah,
It is what it is. There's nothing that's going to change what's happened to me.
right, yeah,
I either deal with it or I don't.
yeah.
If I don't deal with it, it's going to be there for the rest of the day.
I love that. I mean, I love, Alex, your comments resonate so much, and I appreciate them, because I think they reflect a truth that we've got to deal with, right? Which is, if this isn't going away, what's the alternative, right? Like, what's the alternative, right? We can curse the darkness, right? Or you know, we can find a way to accept this and to eventually even embrace it, which is not to say you like it, is not to say you love it, but you come to grips with it. And this is really why one of the therapies that I have had particular success with in my work with patients is something that I would commend to you all. If you're working with a psychologist, I would suggest that you all explore it. And that's something called acceptance and commitment therapy. It's known as ACT. ACT, it's known as ACT. And ACT has to do with, just to take a half step back, many therapies focus on changing your thoughts about things, right? I'm gonna reason with you, Cheryl, and eventually you're gonna say, oh my gosh, I see that I wasn't thinking about that the right way. I'm gonna change the way I'm thinking. That's often a cognitive approach. An ACT approach, rather, is one where I'm changing my relationship with my thoughts, right? Where my thoughts may not change, but I realize that I can coexist with unpleasant thoughts, right? I can coexist with distress. I can coexist with a lot of upset. And that's very empowering. That's the essence of ACT. And that's a construct that at the end of the day is called psychological flexibility. Okay. And psychological flexibility is this superpower that few of us have, but all of us want. And that's the ability to pivot depending on how things unfold, right? And this vaccine injury phenomenon we're talking about, I think it's the case that none of you prepared for that, right? It happened abruptly. There was no preparation. And in that sense, it's very different than coping with things like a diagnosis of cancer. And we see this a lot, even with a long COVID patient. So no one wants cancer, but if you have certain forms of cancer, the way it would work is the doctor would come to you and say, you know, you've got cancer, and here's the plan. You know, we're gonna engage this therapy. There's this new chemotherapy. It's gonna take a year. It's going to take 2 years. Here are how things are going to unfold. And you have a meeting with your family, and you develop a plan, and you cope with it over time. But vaccine injury or long COVID isn't this slow walk. It's much more like, bam, I've just been walking across the street and I've just been hit by a bus, right? There's no preparing. And typically we think that phenomenon is more traumatic and more disruptive because there's no plan. And acceptance and commitment therapy, which says maybe things will change, maybe they won't, but we're going to help empower you to cope with things as they are. That's an approach that we're all going to benefit from. And, you know, we have some support groups. Now, they're not vaccine injured support groups, but they are long COVID support groups. And I know many of you have had COVID. If you've had COVID and would like to join one of our support groups where we talk about concepts from ACT, we'd be delighted. We currently have 4 of them. We have a long waiting list. We had 26 people in one group last week, which is too many. But if you wanted to join our support group and learn about these concepts, it would be a high privilege to help support you all. But I wanted to take a step back. Can anyone react to?
Lost his mic. I've lost audio.
We lost you, Dr. Jackson. Can't
I
hear
was
you.
going to answer. I wanted to finish on. That's what we were talking about. That's one form of what we can deal with.
Yep.
We know we've got COVID, long COVID, or vaccine injured.
Yep.
I think the biggest problem is the people that are not being recognised in any way, denied medically. That's a different type of stress to deal with.
Right.
I don't know how to cope with that because I'm lucky that medically I have everything confirmed. I don't have that problem, but I certainly know, speaking to many vaccine injured and people with long COVID, that door is shutting the face. You don't exist, you're a liar, you're this, you're that.
Yeah.
That is the biggest cause of because if people feel as if they've nowhere to go.
Right. Yeah,
I think that's a big problem.
I agree with you. And I think that's why this group that you all have, it sounds like you all connect this way, is so important because there's a vital need for support, right? There's a vital need for support. And I think with support, this is hard, but going it alone is almost impossible, right? Maybe it is impossible. So it's difficult to overstate how crucial support is. And I think there's an inverse relationship between support and depression, meaning, the more support you have, the less depression you have. It's a little bit of a chicken egg, but the more support you have, the less depression, the less support, the more depression. It's kind of that simple, right? And the limited support will drive you to be more depressed. And as you're becoming more depressed, you are less engaged with other people with regard to support. So I think if I were to have a whiteboard and write a word on the board and circle it, it would be psychosocial support. It would be the presence and existence of support is so vital, especially in the context of a situation where people don't believe you, where you're marginalized. Someone noted that they described to doctors, I think, that the problem is from COVID. So people will be willing to help. And I'm not judging that at all. I totally understand that. I get that. And that makes sense. So I think support is so important. Have people had acceptance and commitment therapy? Are there people who have been the beneficiaries of that approach? And are you familiar at all with that approach?
I did it. Actually, just to kind of shock everybody a little bit and let you into the darkest parts of this for me, I was looking up psych houses to commit myself to.
Yeah.
And so I was looking up what they actually do there.
Yeah.
And all talked about acceptance therapy, right? And so I was like, okay, I can go somewhere and be locked away and I don't know when I'll get out, or I can see if I can work on this on my own. And so I found a therapist that did acceptance therapy, and it was the hardest mental game I've ever had to do in my life. But it definitely, being on the other end of it, it's the best. It's been the best decision that I've been able to make for myself through this whole thing.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And we are starting, we have a social worker at Vanderbilt, Jenna McDonald, and she is starting an acceptance and commitment therapy group in January or February. And if people are interested in attending that group, which will be a module-based group, there will be a start and an end. It'll be probably 8 to 10 weeks free of charge. We'd invite you to join that ACT group because I think it's really important. And the one thing that I'll say about acceptance and commitment therapy, and the one thing I'll say about that as it relates to depression, is that acceptance and the hard work of acceptance and really the hard work of change is made easier if you can attach it to values that you have, right? All of you have values. Denise referenced a younger child that she had, and her value, I'm going to use this word, Denise, but one of your values is family, it sounds like. Is that right? And so that value of family is one of the things that has propelled you to stay alive on your darkest days, right? And on the days where you're screaming in pain and you feel like, oh my gosh, I'd like to end it right now, the thing that has sort of caused you, one thing, not to do that back in the day is, oh my gosh, I value my family, right? So that's propelled you to do these hard things. And what I would be inviting you all to do, what I would invite you to do if you were my patients, but also in this context, is let's figure out what your values are and let's use those as a lever to lean into hard things, right? And if there are not things in your life that you can use to help keep you alive, let's try to find those, whatever those are, right? Let's try to find those, acknowledging that it's not so simple. And let's recognize that depression, even in the context of chronic pain, so many other things, is relatively treatable. And let's not decide, please, let's not decide, I'm going to go this alone, right? I'm going to go it alone. Please don't do that. There are dangers in that, and there are benefits in simple things that a therapist could help you with, like developing a safety plan. Okay, so for years, what psychologists and psychiatrists did with patients is they created these contracts for safety, and often the contracts for safety were not hugely effective because patients felt like, you know, you're backing me into a corner. You're forcing me to make a commitment that I don't really want to make, which is I'm never going to kill myself. And the literature would say that the contracts are not probably that effective. And most people have shifted away from contracts to something a little gentler, which is called the safety plan. And a safety plan basically says, when I become particularly depressed, here's who I'm going to call. Here's what I'm going to do. Here are the steps I'm going to take, so that that's already written down and in place. And I've seen a lot of suggestions here about what sorts of things could be helpful. And it could be art, it could be nature, it could be exposure to a lot of things. I'm seeing another comment here, by the way. We would very much like to have a vaccine injured group. Yeah, you have to have energy to do all of that. That's right. And I'm sorry, it's so true. I mean, there are all these barriers, and I'm not naive to that. But we'd love to start a vaccine injured group. The problem is right now, with 70 people coming through our groups every week, I'm already wildly overcommitted, as is Amy Keel, my colleague. And she's the one, to her great credit, that keeps setting boundaries for me, because I keep saying, hey, Amy, why don't we start 5 more groups? And she keeps saying, you know, Jim, that would be so reckless of you. And then I keep saying, oh yeah, that's right, that would be a really bad idea. So we don't have the bandwidth. But if your experience is you've had COVID, and I'm sorry we don't have a vaccine injured group, but if you've had COVID, you would very much be eligible for our groups, including this upcoming acceptance commitment therapy group. Does that all make sense? And what questions do people have about what I've said?
I just wanted to ask, how would people be able to enroll in the ACT group?
I think what they would do, Amy Keel is on the call here. And at least I think she is. Amy, are you here?
She's probably muted.
She's noting in the chat that you could email Amy, and
Yes.
and okay, and
You can email me. I'll put my email down here.
okay, all right, and it would be I hate to say that simple. When I say that simple, people are like, Jim, don't say that simple, right? Because things are not that simple. But from a process standpoint, it is as simple as this group will be a Zoom group. You know, we're looking for people to enroll. If you had COVID, you're eligible. We're not billing for this. It isn't a clinical encounter. So you can live anywhere in the United States, or for that matter, around the world. I was on a sabbatical in the United Kingdom in 2010. And one of the things we did as a family that was so much fun is we walked up Mount Snowdon, which is in Wales. And I just say that because one of the members of our group lives not far from Mount Snowdon, right? We have somebody in Wales, and we have somebody elsewhere in the UK. We have people in Canada. So wherever you're at, you would be eligible to join one of our groups. And I would recommend it. I think that could be really helpful. Other questions or comments? I don't have a lot more to say, but are there other, the proof of having COVID for these support groups is you telling us you've had COVID. That's all. That's all. are there other questions? I'm looking in the chat.
Well, someone asked, what do you do in your darkest hours to get through? When
I,
that's a
I,
tough question to answer.
yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'm really moved by Viktor Frankl's famous book, Man's Search for Meaning. Have people read that? Have people read that book? Cheryl, what's your take on that book? Did you benefit from the book?
Hope.
Exactly.
Hope in the middle of extreme darkness and when things just seem like they'll never change.
Exactly.
Hope and gratitude, I think,
Exactly.
are probably the biggest things.
Exactly. And if you can find some meaning, that meaning can take you through really dark places, right? So I would commend Man's Search for Meaning to you all. And if you don't have a copy and you need one, you know, I'm glad for us to get one and send it to you. As far as that goes, it's a slim book in paperback, Man's Search for Meaning. Again, these are not quick fixes, right? But the point is, as Cheryl said, there's hope, right? You can dig down deep and find hope. Other questions or comments?
I wanted to say one more thing. When
Please.
you were talking about having a purpose, that aside from having a 21-year-old daughter that I wanted to watch, you know, grow up, I'm a physician, so I've always been, you know, one to help other people and to solve other people's problems. And in the midst of my despair, I spent all my energy trying to help other people, trying to make a community, to get help for everybody. And my family was really upset with me because they felt I was so consumed with it that it was draining my energy and making me sicker. But I
Totally.
honestly believe it saved my life because
Yeah.
it gave me a purpose. I don't think a psychologist or a psychiatrist would have helped me during those hours
Yeah.
because the pain was so horrible. I was so sick. But
Yeah.
I felt like I had all these people that I had to help. And that worked for me. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know what that means about my psyche, but that
I
worked.
mean, I appreciate that comment, and I think I don't disagree with that at all. That is sometimes the best medicine, right? Is not a prescription of you know, Prozac or Zoloft, but it is having this having this this strong drive to make an impact and not to give up, that will not be dismissed or diminished, right? That propels you. So I'm on board completely with that, Denise. And if that means that someone is out of balance a bit, they're out of balance a bit, right? Like generally we want people to be well balanced, if you will, but I think during the pandemic, when I think of the healthcare providers that I knew working in the ICU, their life wasn't remotely balanced, right? Now some of them are suffering from that, but if you have a purpose that propels you, the last thing I'm interested in doing is talking anybody out of that, right? Because that's very adaptive, and I never really want to mess with that. I'm not too interested in trying to destroy the foundation of a house, right? If it's remotely adaptive.
That and hope for me.
And hope, yeah, so
That
important.
hope, my family constantly told me, you're going to get better, you're going to get better.
So
And
important.
I held on to that. I held
Yeah,
on.
and I'm gonna step away and grab something and come right back. Bear with me real quick.
But I would just say to everyone on this call that, you know, being part of a community, helping other people, just having conversations with each other and, you know, leaning on each other is so important. And there are ways for everyone to get involved.
There are. So I'm holding up something kind of precious to me. You might see this. This is Dr. Pierce's compound, Ray V. Pierce. He was a huckster. He was a charlatan, I guess, and a relative of mine who lived around the turn of the century, a little before, and he had a famous hospital called the Hospital for Invalids in Buffalo, New York. And he sold millions of copies of this little medical book, and he sold all this tonic this is the original stuff. I've resisted taking any. You know, what he was offering, the reason I hold this up, you know, he was offering false hope, right? Like this is alcohol and ragweed and, you know, I don't know what else this is, moonshine. It's not going to help you. The good news is, in the mental health arena, at least, mental health therapy can really help you, right? Now, it won't eliminate your chronic pain. It won't undo your vaccine injury, but it can help you find better ways to cope. It's not fool's gold like this is. There really is hope available. And that's what I would invite people to consider, right? That there's hope, there's hope. And even if you don't believe it, try hard to cling to it, right? Because that is what keeps you going at the end of the day. Other questions or comments about any of this?
Bree, could you ask Deborah's question? Because I can't find it.
Okay. So Deborah, she's a mom of an injured teen. So
Yeah.
she says, as a parent, what is the best way to support a minor or young adult child since we are not privy to what is going on in the sessions? We've worked our way through 3 terrible therapists.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think the best way to support them, this is not going to be a very good answer to your book or to your question, right? I'm referencing the book profiles in the chat there, but I think the best way to support them is to try to find a really excellent therapist. And I know that's not an easy thing, right? You're 0 for 3, it sounds like. And if you want to reach out to us and our social worker, if we can help you find a particularly excellent therapist in your area, and if I can use my network of resources and we can find someone that would be terrific, I'm happy to help with that. Therapists range, right, from pretty horrible to pretty terrific. Denise, physicians are much the same, right? And the difference between a great one and a bad one isn't a small difference, right? It's actually a gigantic difference. So trying to find the best therapist you can is vitally important. And if you need help finding one, we're glad to help you find one. I think what's really important, and this is something I emphasize, I've written a book that's coming out in May 9th, actually, which is my birthday, oddly enough. It's a self-help book about long COVID. It's called Clearing the Fog, and Little Brown is publishing it in May of 2023. It's very practical. And one of the things the book talks about is the idea that it's crucial not to just get mental health treatment, but to get the right kind of mental health treatment, okay? That's what's important. So Bree referenced acceptance and commitment therapy, and that's very specific. That doesn't involve Bree laying on a couch and a doctor asking her to free associate, right? That doesn't involve me talking for hours about my mother and how long I was breastfed, right? That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about empirically validated, evidence-supported approaches to treatment, and that's what you need. And the right question to ask your provider is this an empirically validated treatment, right? Meaning, is there evidence supporting this? Some of you need treatment for depression. Some of you, though, likely don't need treatment for depression as much as you may need treatment for PTSD, okay? Because this is highly traumatic. It's a different conversation, right? But although those things overlap, they're not the same. They're not remotely the same. And the treatment approaches are very different. So in depression, you're going to use cognitive therapy perhaps, or you're going to use cognitive and behavioral therapy. ACT wouldn't be a first-line treatment for PTSD. It would be kind of an adjunct for PTSD. But a first line for PTSD would be something like cognitive processing therapy, for instance, CPT would be a popular treatment for PTSD that's empirically validated. PE, prolonged exposure, would be an empirically validated treatment for PTSD. So this is really important. That is specifically asking your provider, you know, you've diagnosed me with depression. Can you explain to me why it isn't PTSD? Or, you know, tell me what the basis is of the diagnosis that you've made. And now that we know what it is, you've told me, I agree, it makes sense. What's the rationale for the approach, right? And in medicine, that is let's put psychology and psychiatry to the side. In medicine, there's broad agreement, not complete agreement, but there's broad agreement among oncologists about how you treat a particular kind of cancer, right? Now it's not completely the case, but generally you're going to see an oncologist at MD Anderson, you're going to see one at Sloan Kettering, you're going to see one wherever you see one, City of Hope, and they're going to do the same sort of thing. But if you see a psychologist, you could potentially get one of 50 different therapies, right? And some of them don't work any better than putting butter on a burn, right? Which I'm told you're not supposed to do, right? It doesn't work. So empirically validated treatments and making sure that the treatment fits, right? This is really important, right? I used to go fishing all the time. If you ask me what's my number one hobby, I would tell you fishing. Now, if you ask me if I ever go, I would say, actually, no. So that's a problem, right? I'm trying to fix it. But, if I'm fishing for northern pike, just to use a simple example, I'm not using night crawlers, right? I'm using minnows, right? If I'm fishing for catfish, I'm fishing on the bottom. I'm not fishing on top of the water. If I'm treating depression, I'm doing one thing. If I'm treating anxiety, I'm doing another. If you have PTSD, it's another. This is so important. Does that make sense, friends? The right treatment. Okay.
The right treatment and the right therapist.
Exactly. The
And
right
that's what
treatment
I
and the right
always tell people, because unfortunately, collectively, we have been gaslit by the medical community, the psychiatric community. We've been really kicked into the gutter.
Yeah.
And I tell everyone, if you're not getting help, find somebody else. Don't stick with
Exactly.
someone who isn't
Yeah.
helping.
Yeah. People use the phrase quit while you're ahead. I actually like the phrase quit while you're still behind, meaning, it's not working. Don't ride all the way down the pole to the bottom, right? Like, don't do that. Don't wait until you're completely exasperated. If you feel like the therapy is not working, let's make a change, right? If I'm the therapist and I'm offended by that, that's a major red flag, right? Because what I should want is what is best for you. And I will say this, and we're approaching 8:00 at the 1 hour mark that we'll wrap up. If any of you want to engage these things further with me, I'm happy to have a conversation with you. I'm busy, my schedule's crazy, but I say that not to say that I'm not willing to. I'm just saying that to say, that conversation probably won't happen tomorrow morning at like 8:15. But if people individually want to engage the issues that we've talked about and have questions that you'd like to address, I'm happy to entertain them. And sometime in December, we could certainly have a conversation, and that's an invitation to all of you. Okay. Is that fair enough? Okay.
One thing I would, before we sign off, I'm going to run a super small group starting on Monday, very last minute.
Cheryl, tell your qualifications.
Well, I am running this group as a peer group. And I am finished my master's in clinical mental health and am in the process of getting my license through the state of Oregon. It's a very long process in the state of Oregon. It's a mess. So I'm running this group as a peer, like a peer support group. It's not therapy. And so if I'm going to put my name and my email in here, and if you're interested, contact me.
And Cheryl, if I may, the support groups we lead, they kind of exist in this hazy zone between psychology led and peer led. And I'd love to talk to you. I don't presume to know, what as much as one might need to know about this space, but I'd love to talk to you and get to know you, learn a little bit about your journey as a mental health provider, and you know, with humility, be a resource for you. If that would be helpful, that'd be my pleasure.
That would be awesome.
Okay, let's do that.
I'll get your contact info from Denise.
Okay, please.
Bree,
Great.
you want to ask one last quick question and then we'll let Dr. Jackson go have dinner.
I'm actually headed to, I've got a little bit of a hobby, which is to buy things on Facebook Marketplace. I don't know if anybody does that, but I'm driving to someone's house to pick a patio setup tonight. So we'll see how that goes. So yes, please, it is true. It is. And a little embarrassing actually to say, but go ahead, Bree.
Oh, okay. So I guess the final question, hopefully this is short, is ACT effective for PTSD?
Yeah, so ACT, what people call ACT, is an approach to therapy that sort of cuts across diagnostic categories. So there's good there's good research support for ACT in the treatment of OCD. There's some evidence for ACT in the treatment of depression, but ACT has more to do with kind of changing a mindset, I would say. So it's not a first-line treatment for PTSD, but these concepts of acceptance, these concepts of living alongside of, that are part and parcel of ACT, those could be, should be vital parts of PTSD treatment. But when we think of empirically validated treatment for PTSD, the main things we think about are prolonged exposure therapy, cognitive processing therapy, and EMDR, which has to do with eye movement, a little more controversial than the other two. Those are the main three, with CPT and PE being the two primary approaches to PTSD treatment. And again, we can have a long, boring, maybe to you boring, not to me, but we can have a long conversation about this if anybody wants to.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jackson. I can't tell you how much we all appreciate you doing this for us.
My
And
pleasure.
we could go on for hours. But
Yeah, no, I know we could. And, you know, I'll be praying for you guys and for people in your community. I know this is hard. We have certainly dealt with the issue of suicide and suicidal ideation and all of that in the context of the groups that we lead. It's scary and it's a challenge, and we've walked that road, so we understand, and we're here to support you. So reach out to me, friends, please. And Denise, if I can be a resource for you in the future, please let me know. Okay.
thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Really appreciate it.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
so much.
Bye-bye.